of karate at the club as well. I'd like to congratulate David and Teresa on the Windsor Karate Club's 35th anniversary and on receiving the Karate Nova Scotia's Club of the Year award, and wish them many more years of success. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Hammonds Plains Lucasville.
Mr. Speaker, small business and buying local are important to the economy of Nova Scotia. And Rob's Farm Market is a small fruit and vegetable stand set up in late spring to mid-fall that provides our community with the opportunity to purchase farm fresh produce. Rob Johnson from Canning has been setting up shop in Hammonds Plains since 2011. He began by selling produce out of his vehicle, accompanied by a couple of tables set up on sawhorses with a canopy type cover. As the need and demand grew, he built a stand that he now sets up for his open season. The fruit and vegetable stand is located on the busy Hammonds Plains Road where thousands of cars drive by daily.
Order, please. Time allotted for member statements has expired. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, no reasonable person wants a teacher strike. Parents don't want it. Students don't want it. Vast majority of teachers, although they voted overwhelmingly against this Premier, they don't want to go on strike, Mr. Speaker. That's why they offered to put the whole issue to a conciliation board. Can the Premier confirm for this House that his government has said no to a conciliation board with teachers?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we said we'd be willing to go to the conciliation board.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, their school year is at risk. Students in grade 12 and in all grades want to know they're going to get through the entire year without a strike. Mr. Speaker, the time for political games is over. Did the government write to teachers and say no to a conciliation board, or communicate it as a no in any other way?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, we in no way said we would not go to conciliation board. Mr. Speaker, what we asked from teachers last week was a list of what they wanted to talk about. We provided back to them the things that we wanted to talk about, and they said no.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, there's only one Premier. It's his job to make sure that our classroom is not interrupted. Every day he says it's up to the union. It's up to the union. Well, at some point, it's up to him. Mr. Speaker, why did he not agree to put this whole matter to a conciliation board in the first place so that parents and students could have the comfort of knowing he's at least trying to work this out?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question again. I want to tell him we agreed to conciliation board. We talked about all the things that were part of that, which would have been the classroom conditions across this province. I want to remind the honourable member that in the first three budgets that we presented to this House, we've invested heavily in classrooms, and their party voted against those, Mr. Speaker. Our record on defending and working with classroom teachers speaks for itself, Mr. Speaker, and their record in this House voting against it also says what they think about classrooms.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is also to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, when this government went looking for votes in the last provincial election, they promised a doctor for every Nova Scotian in our table list. Now they are telling people to call 811 to add their names to a waiting list. Last week, a high-ranking official in the health authority said that every community cannot expect a family doctor. Apparently, the promise should have read a doctor for some Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Will he table a list of communities like Weymouth that will no longer have a doctor?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. You know there's a physician working in Weymouth now along with a nurse practitioner. We have continued to work with communities across the province to provide the infrastructure and the work environment that healthcare professionals want to work in, which is a collaborative practice. You refer to 811, Mr. Speaker. We've asked Nova Scotians across the province who are looking for a family physician to call 811 so that we can keep a record of communities where we are seeing the growth in that, Mr. Speaker. At the same time, we want to make sure that if they require medical attention at that time, we can then direct it to the 811 where there's healthcare providers, which in turn then could direct them to the right healthcare institution.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, in a column in the Local Express this weekend, John DeMont wrote, and I quote, "People, after all, don't want to move to places without schools, doctors, and hospitals for their children." Families and communities deserve to know what the government plans to do to keep their promise of a doctor for every Nova Scotian, and I just tabled that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier tell Nova Scotians what criteria the government is using to decide which communities will no longer have billing numbers issued by Nova Scotia Health Authority?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to again thank the honourable member for his question. We've said time and time again in this House, I've said, the Minister of Health has said that we're looking for collaborative practice of teams across this province. It's what healthcare providers are telling us they want to operate in. We have a rural residency program that is bringing those healthcare providers out into rural communities. Very proud of the announcement last week with nurse practitioners and family practice nurses that will be hiring across the province who will work in communities to enhance some of the collaborative care teams we have now, which 14,000 other Nova Scotians have access to that healthcare team that will also provide them with access to a family physician. So we're continuing to work with communities across this province, Mr. Speaker, to make sure we respond to their needs.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier keeps talking about collaborative practice, but as I told this House last week, the President of Doctors Nova Scotia has said doctors have not been consulted by neither the government or Nova Scotia Health Authority to help shape these teams. I'm beginning to wonder if the Premier actually understands the word or the term collective means. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier tell the people of this province how many years will they have to wait for this government to meet the promise of a doctor for every Nova Scotian?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to again thank the honourable member for the question. I want to thank doctors and healthcare providers across this province. Mr. Speaker, we're working with government to ensure that we provide collaborative practices in communities across Nova Scotia so that communities and residents of those communities have access to primary care access in their communities. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to work with those communities to make sure that we provide that in communities across this province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the expense scandal in Richmond is now ensnaring the Liberal Party more and more every day. Now we know, Mr. Speaker, that the scheme to take taxpayers' money from the people of Richmond and put it into the bank account of the local Liberal Association was actually initiated by a known organizer of the Liberal Party. Only today, Mr. Speaker, did the government or did the party or its caucus actually take action and apparently end their employment with him, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Premier, why did he wait until it became public before he took action to separate his employment relationship with Mr. Sampson, who initiated the scheme to take taxpayers' money and give it to Liberals?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As he would know, Mr. Speaker, individuals made personal checks to an event that was held in that constituency. They made a decision following that, Mr. Speaker. Elections Nova Scotia is looking into that, and that is up to Elections Nova Scotia from there, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's up to the leader of the Liberal Party how he wants his party to conduct business. And business under the Liberal Party in Richmond County is to conspire to take money from taxpayers and put it in the local Liberal account, Mr. Speaker. That's in the Premier's jurisdiction. In fact, when the NDP received illegal illegal contributions a few years ago, the Premier at that time said, "It's awfully strange, though, that when the microscope went on for them, all of a sudden they decided they better start handing the money back." Well, Mr. Speaker, that money still sits in the Liberal bank account. Now that the microscope is on him, will he give the money back to the taxpayers of Richmond?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. The Liberal Party is not under investigation. As much as he wants to continue to repeat falsehoods, Mr. Speaker, there is nothing associated with the Liberal Party. What he was referring to with the New Democratic Party, it was clearly laid out that there was an illegal contribution provided to their campaign. They were provided back. Mr. Speaker, what we have here is that there are councillors in Richmond County who bought a ticket to a Liberal event and was reimbursed by the taxpayers of Richmond County and then asked for a tax receipt, Mr. Speaker, which we all know is inappropriate. And Elections Nova Scotia is dealing with those individuals, not the Liberal Party.
I'd like to remind the Honourable Premier that the term falsehoods is unparliamentary. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, after 3 years in this office, it is clear that this government does not support the aspect of collective bargaining. Take arbitration, for example. This government used to support arbitration until it didn't like the Jim Dorsey findings and fired him. Fast forward a year and we have Bill 148. This is a threatening piece of legislation that will dictate the terms or conditions of contract as soon as arbitration is underway. So I ask the Premier, why does this government continue to cherry-pick its way through labour negotiations?
The Honourable Premier.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the reason for that is because the previous government, Mr. Speaker, decided they were going to open the checkup to organized labour, Mr. Speaker, and take money out of classrooms across this province. Because the previous government, Mr. Speaker, decided it was going to grow wait lists in this province, Mr. Speaker. The previous government ignored the issues of Victoria General Hospital, Mr. Speaker. That's why we're dealing with this in a way, Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotians want us to. In a thoughtful, methodical way. Not a single member of a union in this province is losing a dime, Mr. Speaker. What we're saying to everyone in this province, we all have to be part of the solution of moving this province forward. If you want me to invest in classrooms, then the growth of your benefits have to slow down. If you want me to fix the VG, the growth of your benefits have to slow down. But let me be clear, not a single member of the union in this province is losing a dime, Mr. Speaker. Unlike when that party was in power, every student in this province lost $65 million.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and through you, Mr. Speaker, if I had a Snickers bar, I would offer it to the Premier because he's not quite himself when he's angry. Mr. Speaker, labour relations have shrunk to a new low under this government. I have witnessed all night House settings so this government can ram through its next labour bills. I have seen more healthcare workers at law amendments than we have seen passengers on this year's Yarmouth Ferry. Now we are at the brink of the first provincial-wide teacher strike in this history of Nova Scotia. This government is telling teachers that the collective bargaining process has run its course, even though the teachers
have a question.
requesting further consultation or conciliation board. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier, will he admit today to the teachers, the nurses, healthcare workers, and all Nova Scotians that this government has failed to respect the collective bargaining process?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, just the opposite, Mr. Speaker, is actually the lawyer representing teachers across this province sent a letter to every teacher saying the government has respected the negotiation. Both parties came to the table with different offers, Mr. Speaker, and we came to a resolution. But let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, when that member was in party, when that member was in government, Mr. Speaker, we saw union leader after union leader after union leader march its way across to the Red Room and take away the right to strike from paramedics in this province, Mr. Speaker. When we stand in this House, Mr. Speaker, we're defending all Nova Scotians, not a select few that party did when they were in government.
The Honourable Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister of Municipal Affairs says he has not talked to the member from Guysborough about allegations of improper expenses in Guysborough. My question, Mr. Speaker, has the minister discussed allegations of improper expenses in Richmond with the member for Richmond?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The record's clear on this. There's individuals that made decisions in relation to reimbursements that were very wide, that did include a donation to political parties, and that also included other things that everyone in this House know is inappropriate, Mr. Speaker. The appropriate authorities are investigating those allegations, and it's incumbent upon all of us to allow Elections Nova Scotia and the RCMP to do their due diligence in this investigation so we can have a full understanding of what the issues are.
The Honourable Leader, Member for Pictou West.
Mr. Speaker, we certainly are getting some clarity on the full issues. I mean, today this made national news, and Richmond isn't the only municipality where irregularities and expenses are being investigated. The Ombudsman's office is taking a look at Guysborough County too, and in allnovascotia.com yesterday, the Minister of Municipal Affairs said he hadn't even bothered to ask his cabinet colleague, the former warden of Guysborough, about the allegations. So I will ask the Minister, is he not interested interested in what's going on with the taxpayers in Guysborough, or is he afraid to ask his colleague?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, imagine that member saying that when for the first time in Nova Scotian history we have a government that's moving forward with municipalities to put all of their expenses online, to bring a standardized level of transparency and accountability and regulatory framework around expenses for the first time in this province's history, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs has the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We look forward to continuing our work with our eager municipal partners who share our desire to ensure that we are the most transparent province in this country.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Speaker, my question for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. You know, isn't it interesting, Mr. Speaker, that those involved in the Richmond spending scandal were clamoring to pay back the money they claimed to attend the member for Richmond's re-election fundraiser as soon as it became a media issue for this government last week? Only when those involved had the pain of embarrassing the Liberal Party did they jump to action to try to clear up that mess for the benefit of the member of Richmond. Proof, Mr. Speaker, that this has been a Liberal Party operation. Isn't that why? And I hear the laughter on the other side, Mr. Speaker, but they're showing diagrams on national news today, Mr. Speaker, highlighting the connection. Isn't this why, Mr. Speaker, the government avoided this issue for months to pretend the inappropriate spending did not exist?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The appropriate authorities, from the Ombudsman's Office to the Elections Nova Scotia, the RCMP, are investigating. I know the member opposite has argued in this chamber that the executive branch of government interfere in each of those arm's-length organizations, Mr. Speaker. Now we know what kind of government we're going to have if the PCs are in place, one like their friends Donald Trump and his Republican buddies have down south of the border. It's absolutely ridiculous, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Well, Mr. Speaker, maybe I should have put the comb-over on today, Mr. Speaker. The only thing I can tell you that I've said in this legislature is until the people of Richmond County got the Ombudsman involved, this government ignored their pleas for help. So those involved were clamoring to clean up the mess for the member for Richmond, but there's been no such urgency to pay back the other thousands of dollars they owe the people of Richmond. And I guess until that becomes an embarrassment for this government, we won't see a dime of that money. And also, according to the minister, as he was quoted in All Nova Scotia, we won't see any more municipal forensic audits. Does the minister care about the cost of the audits, not in terms of dollars, but in terms of the cost they will have to a damaged Liberal brand in other parts of this province?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just to be clear, we said that we would not do a forensic audit of every single municipal unit in the province. I think all of us here can agree that that would not be an appropriate use of funds or fair to all of those municipalities. But what we are doing is considering various options to ensure that there is public confidence in our municipal expense program across the province. So we are considering spot audits, Mr. Speaker. We are considering investing in a municipal auditor general. We're looking at all of the recommendations that came forward from the Ombudsman's Office, who I will remind that member is an independent office of this government for good reason, cannot be directed by the Executive Council, Mr. Speaker. They need to be independent, Mr. Speaker. So I'd ask my colleague, Mr. Trump, to please stop encouraging us to involve ourselves in directing investigations that is not...
Order, please. You put me in an awful position to perhaps rule that the term Trump is unparliamentary. I'll have to think about that. The Honourable Leader of the Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Energy. Earlier this year, many independent power producers appeared at the UARB hearing about renewable to retail. They raised concerns about the tariff structure proposed by Nova Scotia Power for access to the use of the grid. Since that time, I understand that UARB has ruled on the proposed tariff structure. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister what has been done in response to the independent power producers on the ruling of the UARB?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
I guess the easy answer would be to ask the independent power producers, but, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that prior to our government being elected, no one other than Nova Scotia Power could provide electricity to Nova Scotians. Our government changed that. We changed the rules to allow a structure to be in place to allow independent power producers to be able to sell directly to Nova Scotians. The process involved legislation in this House. It involved a hearing from the Utility and Review Board. Those tariffs have now been set in place. There is now the opportunity for independent power producers to put a business case together to be able to sell directly to Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, in 2013, the Liberals could not have been more explicit in their promise. That platform reads, and I quote, "We will break Nova Scotia Power's monopoly," end of quote, and I will table this. However, Mr. Speaker, 3 years later, the government seems to be rather silent on this issue. So I'd like to ask the Minister, when will this government break Nova Scotia's power monopoly?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Mr. Speaker, a bit rich coming from a government that for 4 years watched as power rates were going up by 7, 8, 9 and 10%. Which placed a tremendous burden on Nova Scotians. On the other hand, last year we saw a slight decrease in power rates, and this year there was no increase in power rates in our province. Mr. Speaker, the fact is that it'll now be up to private industry via independent power producers to be able to put a business plan together to be able to sell directly to Nova Scotians. We have established a framework to allow that to happen, which is a first ever in our province, and I expect that before too long that the member is going to see more activity on this matter.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Education. Will the province be purchasing or negotiating a lease extension for École Beaujolais?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the question. It gives me an opportunity to say that we have worked very closely with all of the partners in the P3 schools. We have notification dates that we have had to meet. We have met those in the past, and we have met this one, which was October 31st, and there will be information and a release to the effect of the decisions that we've made when that time comes. We have worked with our partner and have agreed that those releases would go out jointly. The partner of whom we are speaking is currently out of the country and will be back tomorrow, and the release will be made then.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as the Minister may be aware, they were expecting, parents, teachers in the school were expecting to find out Monday, and there's actually a public meeting planned Thursday night. I think I just heard the Minister say that the announcement will be made tomorrow, and I'd like her just to confirm that, because there is a public meeting scheduled Thursday night to actually discuss development and transportation issues around that site in specific. And it was scheduled that day specifically because they thought they would know by Monday of this week when what would happen with that school.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and perhaps if the member wants to talk about a specific school, we can do that, but the decision as to whether we continue a lease or whether we purchase a school has nothing to do with whether a school will close. All of the schools that are being considered as part of the P3 have been identified by the school boards as schools that they need in order to continue providing program, and there is no question about whether those schools will close or not. So if there's a suggestion in the community that a P3 decision that was to be notified on Monday will impact on whether the school stays open or not is completely untrue. It has no impact on whether the school will remain open or not.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health. This winter, the Liberals cancelled their hikes to seniors' pharmacare following a province-wide backlash. The province promised consultation before further changes would be made to the program. I think the Minister even in one of his scrums said that consultation would be happening in October. It's now November. And no notice of consultations have gone out to the partner groups. So my question to the Minister is, will the Minister please tell the House when the consultations will take place and why seniors don't know about it already?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think we have made it very clear to Nova Scotians that certainly for next year there will be no increase in the senior pharmacare rate. That program will remain as it is this year. I would say within the next couple of weeks, the full consultations will be underway and outlined as to how all Nova Scotians can participate. We're very, very interested in hearing, especially from those 55 to 65, and their suggestions on keeping the program sustainable over the next decade or two.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Well, I hope the minister is okay with those groups not really believing him at this point until a true consultation actually happens. In the winter, seniors groups were shocked by the huge increases that their pharmacare bills premiums were going up, and with no dates, no information, no feedback, we have to take the minister for his word, and I can accept that, but they were promised a full consultation in October. And it hasn't happened yet. So what precautions is the minister taking to ensure that the upcoming consultations are not a sham like they were the first time?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I agree with the member opposite that we did rely very heavily on the group of 9 to give us feedback, but unfortunately they didn't consult widely. This time we will be consulting. Obviously, the group of 9 will be a part of that, but in terms of the full public participation, this will be outlined here within the next couple of weeks as to how all Nova Scotians can have a say in the future of senior pharmacare.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health again. Seniors have been being placed in long-term care facilities are required to have a family physician before they can be admitted. And many homes struggle to find a doctor for these seniors, and when they do, it's a favor done by that physician because they know how dire that situation is. These comes on top of the added struggles of this government's decision to cut funding to long-term care facilities. And we've talked about the 1% cut each year a number of times in this House of Assembly. Does the minister agree that it is appropriate, given the unfunded vacancies for family physicians in so many areas of the province, that we ask these doctors to do so much more?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the member is that certainly a number of doctors with their Care by Design program, very, very willing participants in the care of our seniors in many parts of the province, and we also have nurse practitioners, RNs, who are involved with their care plan. Now we have, of course, paramedics who are coming to nursing homes as well, especially in terms of stabilizing patients who do run in sometimes to issues that can easily be addressed and not have to take them to an ER.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. These are our most vulnerable, the people that we take care of as a province. And we know that there's a gap here that needs to be truly filled. And I think what the minister tends to present to us are a number of stopgaps in order to try to fill some of those things on a temporary basis, whether it's bringing in paramedics, whether it's bringing in nurse practitioners, or what have you. So what I'm asking the minister is that, you know, I do want him to acknowledge the problem, which I think he did in his previous answer, but truly, how is he going to make sure that doctors are available to these long-term care facilities without giving it too much of a burden to those long-term care facilities in the first place?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The majority of our nursing homes do have access to a family doctor, a physician in the community, or proximity to come in to deal with serious issues involving our seniors in nursing homes. What we're talking about, Mr. Speaker, is the appropriate level of care at particular times. They don't need to see a doctor on all occasions. In fact, our paramedics are well trained. They're now, in fact, assisting with palliative care as well. So I feel very confident in the array of clinicians that work work in our nursing homes.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Natural Resources. Mr. Speaker, listening to the Minister's non-answers on clear-cutting thus far, I don't know whether to laugh or cry. The Minister states in this House that when it comes to a clear-cut target, and I quote, "The goal is unchanged," end quote, and I will table this. However, Mr. Speaker, I will remind the Minister that we are at the 5-year mark and the goal of 50% has not, I repeat, has not been reached. So I'd like to ask the Minister, what new timelines has his department set out to reach this target?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member opposite for the question. Anyone looking objectively at the workforce of the Department of Natural Resources will see that it is a science-based department and makes its decisions based on that science. It's not an arm of industry, it's not an arm of special interest groups in particular, or landowners or otherwise. It is a department of professionals, be they biologists, geologists, surveyors, foresters, hydrologists, entomologists, park planners, firefighters, and one of many other professions. They are Nova Scotians who care greatly about our land, water, and air, and a sustainable future, and I am very proud of all of them.
Yes. The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Well, Mr. Speaker, last year we were told by this government that the province was on track to meet the 50% target. However, through a Freedom of Information request, our caucus has obtained the percentages of clear-cut on Crown lands. And interestingly enough, for 2013 and 2014, Mr. Speaker, and in 2013, 64% of the harvesting on Crown land was clear-cut. In 2014, that number increased to 71%, and I have tabled that. So I'd like to ask the Minister, how will the province ever meet this 50% target if clear-cutting on Crown land under this government is actually increasing?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, of course, the member would understand that there are individual variations on the road to success that occur. Situations influence things on an annual basis, and our objective remains unchanged. I'm very pleased with the progress that we made on the strategy at the 5-year mark, and stay tuned, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Business. Mr. Speaker, small businesses are the engine of our economy, providing jobs and prosperity to our communities. One of these businesses is Ocean Stone Seaside Resort in Chester. Tim Moore employs 45 people at Ocean Stone, but bureaucracy and red tape have him rethinking his investments in this province, and I will table that. And Mr. Speaker, we know that if one business complains, likely 9 out of 10 would not be complaining or would not seek the publicity. My question for the Minister is this. Every session, this government brings amendments to the HRM charter of this House. When will the Minister act to cut job-killing municipal red tape?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have just introduced in the last budget the Office of Regulatory Affairs and Service Effectiveness. They're doing what I would consider groundbreaking work around red tape reduction. Halifax Regional Municipality has recognized the value of that provincial office. They have agreed to partner with the office, provide funding and a single resource, Mr. Speaker, to further review circumstances within HRM for the sole purpose, Mr. Speaker, of seeing the same objectives that the province has achieved.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Minister for that answer. However, groundbreaking is not reducing red tape. Mr. Speaker, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business says there is far too much red tape in Nova Scotia. The organization says excessive red tape has driven some business owners out of the province, and they say municipal red tape can be counterproductive. My question for the Minister is, when will the Minister act immediately to support small businesses and cut this serious red tape problem?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If my colleague was talking to CFIB, he'd know the track record of the province. The Atlantic Vice President, Mr. Speaker, has said that Nova Scotia is leading the country in red tape reduction, and we look forward forward, Mr. Speaker, to the CFIB scorecard this coming February. HRM has recognized the work that the province is doing, Mr. Speaker. They've recognized the work that the Office of Regulatory Affairs is doing, Mr. Speaker, and they want to be part of that work. They are contributing a resource so that the office can support the work and objectives of HRM as well.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Labour. In May 2013, the member for Preston Dartmouth, critic for Workers' Compensation Board, questioned the NDP government why they haven't made the changes to the WCB Act recommended by the Dorsey report. In fact, the Liberals, while in opposition, heavily criticized the NDP for doing nothing and ignoring injured workers. Surely this government wouldn't do one thing in opposition and complete opposite in government. So I'd like to ask the minister, 3 years into the mandate, what action has the minister taken to get which Dorsey recommendations implemented?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As the member well knows or should knows, WCB is undergoing some improvements right now. There are a number of different aspects that they are working on, Mr. Speaker, and I'd be happy to sit down and walk the honourable member through that if he would identify which particular issues he's interested in.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will take the minister up on that and sit down and talk about some of these recommendations and where we're going. But I would say today that back in the fall of 2013, while campaigning, the Premier filled out a survey from the Pictou County Injured Workers Association, and the Premier ticked off yes to all of their statements. One of the statements was a statement that the low level of benefits to workers needs to be addressed. So clearly, well on the campaign trail, the Premier thought we should address the low level benefits to injured workers. 3 years later, I'd like to ask the minister, what action has this government taken to address the low level of benefits that the Premier saw as a problem when he was pandering for votes?
Order, please. I'd like to remind the honourable member pandering for votes is an unparliamentary term. The honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for a question, and of course the honourable member would know that the level of benefits is of course predicated on the amount charged to businesses. So if he would like to have businesses increase the amount that they paid towards WCB, please speak out and let us know, and I'll be happy to pass that along to WCB. Thank you.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, the Premier said that the Nova Scotia film tax credit was the richest in the country, which was not factual. The Premier also said that it was far too rich for Nova Scotians and that the tax credit amounted to a 65% subsidy for the entire industry. Again, not factual. The Premier also said that the industry was not experiencing growth with the film tax credit in place. Not factual, Mr. Speaker. In fact, with the film tax credit in place, the film and TV industry supplied $180 million to the GDP, along with 3,200 jobs in 2014. So my question for the Premier, Mr. Speaker, is, does he believe that these statements and his attitude is consistent with his 2013 campaign promise to extend the film tax credit for 5 more years?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what I said was, Mr. Speaker, as a percentage to the growth in Canada, Nova Scotia's growth had not changed, Mr. Speaker. And yes, we were providing a 65% labour subsidy in this sector, Mr. Speaker. We believe we've struck a balance that provides a 25% all-in spend balance across all Nova Scotia sectors, Mr. Speaker, who are supporting and investing in the film industry, Mr. Speaker, and we're beginning to see, Mr. Speaker, the results of that.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have to repeat, 65% of the entire industry is absolutely unfactual. That is not true. Also, Mr. Speaker, the industry was growing until the changes were made, and now, unfortunately, they're not growing as fast as they were. Mr. Speaker, industry representatives are telling me that this government, without stakeholder consultation or consideration, undertook significant changes to the independent filmmaking structure in Nova Scotia, which caused a cultural cultural and financial meltdown that has affected the lives of countless Nova Scotians. So to make it plain, Mr. Speaker, this would be like suddenly forcing the fishing industry to go back to fishing with nets and dories in order to try and catch the same amount of fish. So my question for the Premier is, how can the Premier justify cutting a rebate of $24 million to a thriving creative economy and then turning around and giving the same amount in payroll rebates to some of Canada's richest banks like the RBC, TD, and Butterfield's Offshore Bank in Bermuda?
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for her question. Mr. Speaker, I again want to tell her and all members of this House we have the largest subsidy of any sector that we have in this province, Mr. Speaker, is the film industry. It's a 25% all-in spend, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure whether she is against those other jobs that she's referring to within inside of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure whether she's opposed to those jobs, Mr. Speaker, or was she going to think that we should take $65 million out of classrooms, Mr. Speaker?
Order, please. The honourable Premier has the floor.
Make a balance to be fair to all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We're all going to be part of getting ourselves back to balance, and Mr. Speaker, we will all be part of the growth.
The honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Labour. Mr. Speaker, the Teachers Union asked for a conciliation board. The government repeatedly has said that they want to talk to teachers. Here we are on the deadline. I would like to ask the Minister of Labour, has she received notice from either party, either withdrawing their interest in a conciliation board or declining to participate in a conciliation board?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and I would remind the member that the Minister of Labour deals with these parties confidentially, and we don't typically talk about what they're telling us. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to remind the Minister of Labour of her own words in this House last week, where she said she would separate herself from the government, from the Executive Council, and act impartially between the teachers and between their employer, which is the government. Mr. Speaker, that remains true today. Fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that the government put out a statement earlier today itself which says, and I quote directly, that the Nova Scotia Teachers Union has declined the opportunity to participate in a conciliation board. Now, that is either true or it is not true, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister of Labour, on behalf of all parents and students who want to know the answer, did the Teachers Union decline the conciliation board, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question, and as I have previously indicated, we do prefer the two parties speak for themselves. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Business. DSME was placed in receivership in February 2016, and since that time, PricewaterhouseCoopers has received about $700,000 in fees, and they continue to get more fees every month. In June, PricewaterhouseCoopers said that they had received a number of offers to buy the plant as a going concern. That was in June. Here we stand here today, Mr. Speaker, in November. People want to know what's happening, so I'd like to ask the Minister if he can update the House on what is the status of the DSME situation with the offers from the people who want to buy it as a going concern.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The receiver in the DSTN matter continues to engage proponents. That work continues. We want to be very diligent in the work that is undertaken, and we want to ensure where opportunities exist for continued operations of that facility in Pictou County, that will be the priority. As we speak, those discussions continue.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, time is moving on. Time is moving on, and the Minister of Business, the person responsible for business in this province and economic development, has a role to facilitate a discussion and some positive movement on this, and yet we're seeing nothing. And people are wondering what the minister is doing. And many people are saying he's not doing anything. And today I kind of heard an answer from him that suggested the same thing. So I'd like to ask the minister, What is he doing? What role is he taking? Pricewaterhouse will sit there for as long as it takes and get a monthly fee. The Minister of Business should be trying to facilitate business. What's he doing?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That member is an accountant, and he knows that government should not be interfering in the processes that receivers undertake. Mr. Speaker. Rest assured, Mr. Speaker, we have full confidence in the receiver. We have full confidence in the receiver, Mr. Speaker. We will be diligent in the work to find and secure employment for Pictou County. And I want to remind that member, Web.com just announced, through work with this government and NSBI, 300 positions in Pictou County, Mr. Speaker. That's what this government is doing for Pictou County.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When this government brought forward their budget in the spring, they promised that new wage grants for early childhood educators would give a much-deserved increase to these workers. The minister also said she would bring wages up to the national average, both of which I would applaud. Unfortunately, what she meant was that the grants would bring early childhood educator wages up to the 2012 national average, and that some workers would see increases in wages. So what we're hearing now from the sector, Mr. Speaker, is that centres that were already paying fair wages have seen little benefit, and many long-serving educators have not had a pay increase. So my question for the minister today is, does the minister think it's acceptable that long-serving early childhood educators have not seen any benefit from this new grant?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm really happy that the topic of childcare has been raised in the House today. We certainly have recognized as a government that for too long the wages for early childhood educators were kept at the bottom as far as our comparison across Canada, and I would also suggest that the subsidy for parents was kept too low. In fact, for over a period of 4 years under the previous government, $6 million was taken away from early learning in this province.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, while I do agree with the minister that I think this is a very important topic and that these educators need to have their wages raised and also have better subsidized care for the parents. In fact, under the NDP, we invested $28.8 million in early learning and child care, and we also increased subsidized child care spaces in 2011 and 12. So, Mr. Speaker, the shortage of child care spaces has been a problem for a long time. The actions of this government have made the sector even more unstable. So by setting wages, capping fees, and distributing grant funds unevenly, the government has actually put both private and non-profit child care centres in a difficult situation. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is for the minister, if grants don't make up the difference between wages and fees, both of which have been set by the province, then how does the minister expect child care centres to actually remain open?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the first things that we did was to do a review of childcare across this province. There were two findings in particular that were very disturbing. One was that many parents who were eligible because of their income for a subsidy were not able to pay the difference between the subsidy and what the fees were being charged by the operators. So we immediately invested in subsidies for those parents, and in order to keep that gap from getting wide, there certainly had to be a cap on the parent fees. We put that cap on. It has allowed more than 700 new families to take part in subsidized daycare, which is absolutely the right thing to do.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is the Minister of Labour. The government put out a statement today that says that the Teachers' Union declined to participate in a conciliation board. That statement could only be made to the Minister of Labour, who is the one that either side appeals to call for a conciliation board. Mr. Speaker, the government's already talking about what the teachers may or may not have done. That minister has a duty to be impartial. She has an opportunity to bring together a conciliation board and end this impasse without a strike. I would like to ask her straight up, for all the parents that are wondering, when the government says that the teachers union declined to participate. Is that statement accurate?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
As I have already indicated to the member opposite, this is a confidential process. We prefer the parties speak for themselves. They have spoken. Thank you.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I'll redirect my question. I will redirect my question to the Premier, Mr. Speaker, because obviously the finger-pointing has begun. The childishness about who said yes and who said no is not worthy of a grade 3 classroom, and yet that is exactly the game playing that the government is now participating in. If the Premier has a letter from the teachers saying we will not participate, he should table it. But better than that, and this is my question, Mr. Speaker, rather than play such childish finger-pointing games, will he, before the deadline later today, say yes to conciliation and end this sorry mess?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. If you don't mind, I'll read from the bulletin put out by the Nova Scotia Teachers Union, Bullet 3. The President responded to the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development this morning, stating that the NSTU will not accept any preconditions on conciliation boards, referring our belief in free and full collective bargaining. Mr. Speaker, we said we're more than prepared to go and sit down at the conciliation board, Mr. Speaker. They
Order,
said no.
please. The Honourable Premier has the floor. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Internal Services. Since 2013, the number of information requests received by government departments has been relatively stable. However, the fee estimates issued have more than tripled. In 2013, fee estimates for information requests received by government departments totaled $10,683, but in 2015, fee estimates were $32,543, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister, can he explain why there's been such a dramatic increase in fees for access to information?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Mr. Speaker, contrary to what the member is stating, the amount of applications for FOIPOP requests have gone up significantly, over 25%. The amount of fees the members...
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to orders of the day with government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, to please call government motions.
We'll now call government motions.
To please call address in reply.
We'll now call address in reply. The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to once again stand in this remarkable time-honored building. It gives me equal pleasure to stand amongst my esteemed colleagues and friends, my fellow members of this Legislative Assembly. For me, it is both an honor and a privilege to represent the good people of Victoria the Lakes. It's a